Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second lesson of the Music Production Essentials course. In this lesson, we'll learn how to make drum patterns using MIDI and audio samples. Let's name this project Lesson 2. Then switch to Arrangement View and set the tempo to 90 BPM. Okay. And we will start by creating a new MIDI track. For this, right-click here and choose Insert MIDI Track or press the hotkey Command-Shift-T. And now let's take a look at our first instrument, which is called Drum Rack. To do this, let's go to the browser and select our drum rack in the Instruments category. Then double-click on it or drag it onto the MIDI track that we have created. We have our drum rack in the bottom panel right here. And now we'll create a drum kit with one-shots. Go to the Sample Pack folder, then Drum Kits, and select 3 samples: kick, snare, and a hi-hat. Let's drag each one of them to an empty slot in our drum rack. Let's activate the computer MIDI keyboard function. To do this, turn on this button, which is located over here in the top panel. This function allows you to play MIDI notes by using your computer keyboard. Great! Now let's create a new MIDI clip. To do this, select the desired area on your track, right-click and select Insert MIDI Clip or hotkey Command-Shift-M. At the bottom, we have opened our MIDI editor and piano roll. Switch to the 8th note grid. Now let's draw a pattern for our hi-hat. To create a note, left-click in the MIDI editor 2 times. To delete a note, double-click on it again, or this can be done by using the delete key. Next, let's put our kick at the beginning of each measure and add the snare in between. Let's add some more kicks here. So in this way, we have formed a pattern that consists of 3 one-shot samples. Now let's go back to our drum rack and look at a few basic parameters of the sample. Here we can adjust the start and end of our sample, fades, pitch parameters, sensitivity, and a volume. There are even more different parameters and settings, but we will return to them later. Let's go back to our MIDI editor to take a look at another important aspect called Smart Grid. The Smart Grid allows you to glue notes and samples to the particular durations that you choose. For example, if you have mistakenly played notes out of the project's tempo, you can fix that with the help of the quantize function. The program will glue everything to the grid depending on which duration type you have selected. In order to change the grid in the MIDI editor or the timeline, you need to right-click and then in the Fixed Grid parameters, select the necessary grid. If you want to turn off the grid, you can turn it off by selecting Off. Let's take a look at another important parameter in the MIDI editor, which is called velocity. This parameter is responsible for the dynamics of our notes. To get a better understanding of how it works, let's change the velocity on the hi-hat so that it sounds less robotic and has a more lively feel. To do this, let's go to the lower section in the MIDI editor. There are columns under each note. Let's reduce every second one of them somewhere by 30% by dragging a mouse or by pressing Command and clicking on a note so that you can move the mouse up or down to change velocity. You can also draw notes in the MIDI editor with a pencil. To do this, you need to activate the pencil button. It's located over here. Or you can press the hotkey Command B. Also, there is a fold button in the MIDI editor that folds all the notes without unnecessary information. It can be very useful at work. Now let's duplicate our pattern. To do this, select the MIDI clip, right-click on it, and select Duplicate or press the hotkey Command D. In order to combine our two clips into one, we can consolidate them into one by using the Consolidate function, or by pressing Command J. And we have created our MIDI pattern. Perfect. Now let's take a look at another technique and remake the same pattern by using one-shot samples on the timeline. To do this, we will create 3 audio tracks and name them accordingly to our instruments: kick, snare, and the hi-hat. Next, let's use the file manager, with the help of which we can quickly access all the files that are already used in the project. This way, we don't need to look for each sample through the browser. To do this, go to the File, then Manage Files menu, and on the right side, the File Manager section will appear. Choose Manage Set, View Files, and now you can see all the files that we have already used in this project. Now, in order to quickly locate them in the browser, let's press the swap button and our file will be displayed in the browser on the left. After that, we simply drag it to the corresponding track on the timeline. Let's find the remaining 2 samples in the same way. Great! Let's press the mute button on the drum rack track. But before that, let's make sure that our one-shot is adjusted right. Let's do the same thing for the kick and snare on the timeline. And for this, we'll use the basic functions of navigation and editing: Command C, Command V, Command D, and Command Z. In order to cut the sample, just select a part and press Delete. Or you can use the split function by right-clicking and choosing Split. Or you could do this by pressing the hotkey Command E. You can also simply pull the start or end of the sample to get the desired result. To make your life easier, I would suggest you to select the identical parts and copy them for the entire duration of your loop. The fade function is a very much needed tool as well. It's available directly on the sample itself. You can see how the fade in, fade out parameters appeared on our clip. And select the most suitable grid for us and remake the hi-hat pattern. But before that, let's make sure that our one-shot is adjusted right. For this, let's cut off the extra piece at the beginning here and then arrange it on the grid. To edit the sample, I have turned off the snap to the grid option, but to arrange the pattern, I turn it back on so that our pattern would match our BPM. Now let's copy our hi-hat and change the gain parameter a little on every second sample in order to get the same dynamics as in our MIDI pattern. To do this, double-click on our sample and below has opened a window where you can see your audio wave with the parameters. Now in the left section we will reduce the gain knob to get the necessary dynamics. Don't forget that the mute and solo buttons on the tracks allow us to turn off and isolate the instruments in order to make it easier to access the reference track with our MIDI pattern in the drum rack. One of the main hotkeys is the spacebar, which works like a play and a stop button. And in order to start playing from the right place, you need to press the hotkey Shift Spacebar. Cool. You can also record your drum pattern by playing it with the computer keyboard, for example, and then adjust it in the editor, like this. Finally, let's take a look at how we can save our drum kits in the drum rack. For this, click on the save icon, name it, and save. We have saved the preset of our drum rack, and then in the future by selecting it, you will already have a ready-made drum kit. We have made our pattern with one-shot samples on the timeline, and now let's sum it all up. In this lesson, we have learned how to create drum patterns by using MIDI notes and samples, explored the editing and navigation functions, as well as the main parameters of the samples. And we got familiar with the MIDI editor and learned how to work with the MIDI notes. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to work with the samples, loops, and MIDI in more detail. We'll learn how to record and manipulate audio, and we'll discover some more instruments and devices. See ya!